storytelling is not the issue. Story shaping is where we all fall down. And I am determined to move you from storytellers to story shapers so you can actually create magnetic and compelling stories that people lean into and want to know more of. Let's get into it, shall we? Let's actually get into the secrets in episode 24. We're going to start unveiling to you the secrets of story shaping. Now, one of the things that I mentioned as we started diving into stories was that when we Google the importance of storytelling and communication, Google delivers 1.3 billion resources for us in like less than a second. And so storytelling is not the issue. Story shaping is where we all fall down. And I am determined to move you from storytellers to story shapers so you can actually create magnetic and compelling stories that people lean into and want to know more of. So episode 24 is called Story Shaping 101, The Structure of Story. And that is because, yet again, I'm going to hit you with some structure because these are really important to understanding how to shape. Why we need to structure our stories is for a couple of reasons. Number one is not all stories are created equal. And when we go to shape stories, rather than just tell the stories, sometimes we realize they're not strong enough. So when we actually just literally unfold a story and tell it, we can fall in love with the sound of that story, even though it may not actually be strong enough to make it to a stage or a platform. So in learning how to shape stories and understanding why we should and how we should, we quite often can actually eliminate the stories that are actually not strong enough to be told from a stage or a platform. That's number one. The second thing is we need to structure our stories in a way that actually we're not telling all the detail. So we need to be able to do it so we create spaces for our audiences to put themselves inside the story beside us. And this is critically important in that whole shift from I like you to, oh, I am like you. An audience member cannot do that unless you provide the space that they can put themselves into the story with their own story running alongside yours. Now, if we just unfold and we give all of the detail, what we're risking is actually keeping people one step removed from us. We're keeping people from coming up to us and saying, or keeping people firm in the red zone where they come up to and say, your story's so amazing, you're so courageous, you're so brave, you're so good, and actually not getting anywhere, right? So the only way we can get people coming up and sharing with us what our stories elicited for them, the emotional response that they experience, the visceral response they experience, the things they started thinking, the only way they can come and share that with us is if we actually allow the space for them to put themselves inside the story with us. Now, the most incredible thing happens when you actually do this well, because they will come and tell you parts of the story that you told that you know you didn't tell. Our tendency without this information is to try to correct them. But you've actually just landed them in the perfect place because they are so far inside your story with you that their own story has overwritten the narrative of yours. That is complete trust. Absolute, total, complete trust in who you are. The third reason why we structure our stories is because we've spoken several times in different episodes about your through line, the blue apple, the controlling argument, the central idea, all the things that actually keep us on track. And we need to shape our stories so that they actually support that through line. They support that bold idea. They support the blue apple. They support the controlling argument. They support the central idea. We actually need to shape our stories to make sure that they do that. Not all stories have to be told in full in order to be able to do that. In actual point of fact, most of the times, if we tell stories in full, what we're actually doing is we're actually obscuring the message. We're actually confusing the through line. This is when people feel like we're rambling and yes, great story, but what did you actually mean to tell me in it, right? We expect stories to give us something. We expect stories to take us somewhere. And if you're not shaping stories deliberately, then you will never be able to do that. People might find it entertaining. People might laugh. People might tell you that they love it. People might be taken aback by it. People might be shocked and horrified by it, but you actually won't land the message of what you want to give them, right? So super important. So when we shape and space our stories, we actually have 3 to 5 major chunks only. And through those 3 to 5 chunks, we have through lines and connectors. So I'm going to walk you through the stories. You're going to be listening to me, but please know that there is a downloadable available which will give you the visuals of these structures. So let's run through them, shall we? There are a number of story structures that we use. Some people will naturally lean towards others. Some people will only ever use one type of story. And there is no right or wrong here. This is not about you need to know all the story structures so you can do it all the different ways. This is so you can actually identify what story structure you're going to love and what story structure you're going to use to make sure that you shape your stories. So the first story that we're going to talk about is a simple story structure. And in simple terms, that is, it opens with a challenge or a scene or a setup. It talks about what we had to do to fix that challenge, and it ends with a result. So from left to right, it opens with a challenge, it talks about what we had to do, and it ends with a result. Now, there are three key chunks, and when you look at the visual, you'll see a line run behind those three key chunks. That line is our through line. That line is where we put the connectors to shift our audience from chunk 1 to chunk 2 to chunk 3. Now, if you've listened to episode 23, you would have actually heard me explain Eliza's founder's story, her business story of origin for the Farmless Days app. That is a perfect, simple story structure, which brings to bear the other thing that I want to share with you. It does not matter which story structure you use. It's not that one is more powerful than the other. It's that you use something to shape your story, to not actually overwhelm your audience in the stories, and to make sure that the parts that you are landing speak into the message you want them to take away with them. So that's number one. The simple story structure opens with a scene set or a challenge. The next chunk is what you've done to resolve that challenge, and the next chunk is the outcome. Or with Eliza's, it's giving context, going to the problem, and going to the realization. Simple story structure, 3 key chunks only. The second story structure I want to speak to you about is the hero's journey. Now, I want to reference and acknowledge the full hero's journey. There are actually 17 stages and phases in the full hero's journey as written by Joseph Campbell. It is actually movies and books, and so much of the most powerful stories that we know of in the world are based on the full hero's journey structure. This format that I'm about to run you through is for the hero's journey within a speech structure. So a story within a story, if you like. We don't actually want all 17 stages, but what we do need at the end is the hero returning with the elixir, the hero returning the wisdom and the insights and the knowing to share. That's what we need to end with. It doesn't matter whether you're doing this abridged version for speaking or the full storytelling Joseph Campbell style. That is the key. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned that you need to be able to step from hero to guide, right? Really important. So the hero's journey structure, when it comes to speaking, is very simple. It is 3 chunks connected with connectors. So the first chunk is simply life was great. So open, life was great, life was amazing. The middle chunk was life was not so great, right? When I'm live in a classroom, I'll use a lot more colorful language, but literally life broke. And then the last chunk is life was great again, and this is what I learned, right? So there's 3 chunks in a triangular format. Life was great, life was not great, life broke, and life was great again. And this is what I learned. This is the wisdom I have to share with you. Okay, so again, 3 major chunks that can actually traverse an entire lifetime or an entire period or multiple events, and they just simply have connectors in between, right? So think of it this way. The story structures are kind of like having stones that you step on to get across a creek. It's not all of it, but when you look down and if the water's clear, in between those stones, you can see the rocks, you can see the little fish, you can see the sand, you can see the water running under. You still see all the things, but you glance over that and get your foot firmly onto the next stone. So this is what story structures do. Give us the stepping stones that we need to cross the creek with you. So the hero's journey, again, in simple format, is life was great, life broke, life was great again. This is what I learned. And this is what I want to share with you. This is the wisdom I bring. So that's the hero's journey. The intense hero's journey, because let's face it, some of us have very big stories. And that's not just lived experience. That can be worked experience as well. The intense hero's journey is the same structure. Life was great, life broke, and life was great again. And here's my wisdom to share. But it has a touch point halfway on both axes. So life was great. I fell to my knees. I went to the floor. I saw a light. I climbed the stairs, right? So it's a really powerful thing. Now, again, what I'm doing with this is we actually got no more than 5 chunks in this story that we've shaped on purpose to deliver a message. So life was great. I fell to my knees. I went to the floor. I got to my feet and I saw the light. And this is the result. And this is what I learned. This is the wisdom I have to share. Really important that you remember that. So that's the intense hero's journey. If we have a big lived or worked experience journey that we really want to bring home all of the elements without overwhelming, that's how we do it. It's also, I've seen that intense hero's journey used really well with researchers and actually reporting back, if you like, on a project experience. But researchers use that really, really well. The other one is a flipped hero's journey. So a flipped hero's journey is as it says, is as it sounds. So we start off with life was really bad. We go to life was really great. And we go to life was bad again. The lights went out again. But the secret with this is that the only time we can use the flipped hero's journey is actually when we're going to share the wisdom and the insights. So you can use the same story in an actual hero's journey and flip it on purpose to a flipped hero's journey to deliver a different message. So I have one hero's journey story that I talk about that involves my family. So I won't actually give all of it here, but it talks about a trip around Australia. And it talks about packing everything up, semi-retired in our 30s, hitting the road with our 3 children for 6 to 12 months to travel Australia. It talks about the exquisiteness of the start of that trip. And then we talk about, in the hero's journey, in the original format, I talk about actually losing everything in the GFC when we were offline in the Kimberleys in remote Australia. Then I talk about actually going right to the floor when we had an accident that took everything else from us. Our car caught alight while we were driving and burst into flame. And I really felt as though God was saying this is a clean slate. Everything was taken from us except for our children and each other. I then talk about actually recovering by going to a 6-figure executive role that I had that allowed us to rebuild our finances, and then actually moving back to where we had come from, to the region we had left, and rebuilding our businesses and our financial position and all the celebration that came with that and what we learned along the way. The flipped version of that is an actual point of fact. We start with the bad. We start with the fact that we were selling everything up in a desperate attempt to save our marriage and our family. We then moved to life was amazing, which is all about the experiences that we had and the things that we were doing and all of that, to the point where we realized that this was nirvana. We had created nirvana. We didn't actually care if the trip ever ended. We actually were so happy, so well resourced as a family unit, as a couple. And then I talk about actually the GFC and the fire all in one. And then I talk about actually getting back to where we had come from, as I spoke about before, and creating everything, and yet our marriage still disintegrating, because what we learned on that was that we cannot outrun our problems. So that's just very simple ways of explaining how they can be used for different purposes. Both are still the truth. Both are still accurate. But I use one version or the other depending on, you guessed it, the blue apple. What was my purpose for sharing these stories? So that's the flipped hero's journey. So the hero's journey, the intense hero's journey, and the flipped hero's journey. Then the next story structure is crescendo, which we also use as a speaking structure. The crescendo can be used as a story structure. So starting off with something low-key that builds and builds and builds until something of great intensity. Now, what's really important with this is we are talking about stories within a greater story, stories within a full speech. So that crescendo should be no more than 3 to 5 points. It cannot be 7 or 9, as it can be in a full speech. You can definitely use the crescendo structure to shape your story within a speech. Then the next story type is one that I love, and this is the choice point story. And it's simply, if you think about 2 loops, so 3 chunks across the top and 2 loops connecting those 3 chunks. A choice point story starts with a high impact event. Now, that a high impact event can be for good, and it can also be a high impact event that shatters our world. So it can be both. It's simply a high impact event. The first loop between the first 2 chunks, the first loop is our response to it. And that includes our internal dialogue and emotions and visceral physical responses to whatever that high impact event was, almost like our internal processing of it, until we get to the middle chunk of the 3 chunks across the top. And this is literally a choice point. This chunk is, I had a choice to do this or to do that, and a choice to do this or to do that. It's literally a yes or no moment. It's a go here, go there moment. It's a crossroads moment. It's a choice point. And that is a very quick chunk, but it's literally, I had a choice to be this or I had a choice to be that. The second part of that story loop, the loop that goes from the second chunk to the third chunk, that loop is a run through, an overview of the things you had to do once you made that choice to turn that into action. And then the last chunk is actually the results or the outcome of making that decision, that yes or no action, right? Now, the perfect example I have of this is a story shared by Danielle Woodhouse, who was in our women's volleyball team for Australia. And with Danielle, we were in an environment and she was just talking actually very naturally. I think it was over a lunch break. And she was telling a story of being in the gold medal team in Sydney in 2000. And with that story, what it was she told about, winning the semifinals, knowing they were in the gold medal match the next day, being on a high, running through the athletes' village, literally swinging herself around a corner towards her room and bumping into her coach. Her coach then stood back and looked at her and said, "Oh, Danielle, I've been wanting to catch you. I need to let you know that we're benching you for tomorrow." Now, she admits that there were probably a lot more words that he said, but that's all she heard. And she then goes into her actual visceral internal response to that statement, her world stopping, what was happening, her internal dialogue. And she goes into how she felt. She goes into actually walking into her room. She goes into all of the emotions and inner dialogue that ran for that. And then she talks about getting to a moment where she realized she had two choices here. She could either let this derail everything about her experience, or she could show up as if she was still a member of a gold medal winning team. And she decided to do the second. She decided to still show up as a member of a gold medal winning team. And the next loop, the second loop, when she made that decision, talks about what she had to do. And the third chunk, the outcome, if you like, is she talks about the moment that they won the match, the gold medal match. They won the match and she jumped the fences into the pool. And because of her attitude, she was still well and truly a member of a gold medal winning team for her team. Now, that story is incredibly powerful. That is what a choice point story does. But like I said, whichever story structure you choose, what is important is that you use a structure to shape your stories, to land us in moments. It's really important that you land only 3 to 5 key chunks of information, that you have your through lines and connectors joining those 3 to 5 chunks, that you shape it deliberately for the audience to take away what you need them to take away, right? No story structure is more correct than the other. They are all powerful. What matters is that you know them and that you use them deliberately to strengthen your storytelling so you become a storytelling master.